It's not research if you don't invite failure. And that means that failure is going to be a common experience for anyone who engages in research. If you only read published research, it's easy to get an excessively rosy impression of the success rate for research projects. Lots of research projects fall apart, they don't get published, and so you tend not to hear about them. It's not just the case that journals are biased towards publishing projects with positive results. They're understandably biased towards publishing projects that have results, period, whether they're positive or negative. The situation is especially unfortunate for students embarking on their first research project, because most students won't have a realistic idea of the likelihood that their project will end in failure. In my presentation here, I'd like to relay some of my forays into cross-cultural music research. I'll start with a story of failure. Lest you fear that my talk will relay only failures, I'll then go on to present a more successful recent venture, and I promise you that you'll see some data and indeed some informative, interpretable results. Before I begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging my partner, Kristen Percoda. Kristen's a truly talented linguist. She has an incredible knack for picking up languages on the fly, and for a linguistic dolt like me, her skills seem little short of miraculous. In addition to her language skills, her enthusiasm for travel, and her love of cultural awareness, I couldn't have done any of this without her. Before retiring last year, I calculated that we'd conducted perhaps 150 experiments in my lab over the years. Right from the beginning, like other folks, I've been aware of the dangers of relying too much on the staple convenience sample of local undergraduate students, the proverbial weird population. A given experiment might point to a particular conclusion, but then we're understandably haunted by the thought that this may only characterize listeners in central Ohio and not generalize to the wider world of people. In the 1990s, I was already looking for ways to run experiments beyond the usual weird sample. One could resort to recruiting from local immigrant communities, but ideally we'd aim for research participants who have had little or no exposure to Western music, and that means traveling to some ostensibly remote corner of the world. I had the good sense to know that it'd be a bad idea to rush into some remote region of the world and try to foist an experiment on people. So my first idea was that I should reach out to anthropologists and ethnomusicologists and aim to build some sort of collaborative team. If you're going to do research abroad, you'll need people with the appropriate linguistic and cultural expertise. I've been a member of the Society for Ethnomusicology for the past quarter century, and if you hang around ethnomusicologists, you'll be aware of the rather dim view many have for people who do music psychological research. There's some legitimate concerns here. Going into some community with the intention of coming away with data slips all too easily into the long history of colonial behavior of take, and take. There are plenty of other issues as well. Of course, there are also ethnomusicologists who are sympathetic to cognitive research. In the 1990s, I made friends with 4 sympathetic colleagues. Initially, all 4 were warm to the idea of conducting collaborative experiments in the field. However, when push came to shove, with the exception of David Harnish, who helped with an experiment we did with a visiting group of gamelan musicians, they all got cold feet. Anthropologists are a pretty self-critical group. Anyone familiar with the field will know that anthropologists already do a good job of tearing each other apart, not to mention people from outside the discipline. In retrospect, I think my potential collaborators probably made a wise decision not to collaborate with me, since conducting field experiments would almost certainly have tarnished their reputations. By the year 2000, I'd concluded that if I wanted to do any cross-cultural experiments, I'd simply have to bite the bullet and push ahead without the assistance of a culturally knowledgeable collaborator. In order to gain some experience, it's useful to hang out with someone who's had lots of field experience. So I took advantage of an Earthwatch program to assist Russian ethnomusicologist Yelena Minyanok, who's shown here, in collecting recordings in rural Russia. Fortunately, Kristen's fluent in Russian, so it was a good fit. We made our way to the tiny village of Filanovskaya in the Volgograd region, and there we spent a week recording old Cossack songs. Old Cossack songs is a genre of music that's perhaps best described as improvised polyphonic choral music that seems as close to heavy metal as you can get with just a bunch of human voices. It's remarkably raucous music. There are a lot of practical concerns involved in field recording. It's essential to find a quiet place to record, and it can be a challenge getting your musicians to show up on time, or even simply just to show up. In rural Russia, I discovered that it's a challenge figuring out how to be sociable when you really don't want to drink a lot of vodka. Of course, you can't spend time with people without forging friendships, and inevitably you come to value many of the people you meet. Some people are extraordinary, and that was the case with this woman, Elizaveta Arsentievna. Elizaveta had an extraordinary knowledge of the old Cossack song repertoire. She was the lead singer and the one who'd remind the other singers of the lyrics they'd forgotten. Here she is with Vasily Nikolaevich. Vasily proved something of a challenge to record. At times he tended to thump his walking stick during a recording, and several times I'd have to crawl over and place my hand on his foot to stop him from tapping it. I remember when we arrived, Elizaveta told us that all her life she'd been waiting for someone to come and record all of the songs she knew. After we'd finished a week of recording, Elizaveta declared, "Now I can die." And then, tragically, just 2 months after our recording session, she did indeed pass away. Well, Filanovskaya was certainly remote, but it wasn't culturally isolated. For my next venture, my aim was to try to scout out locations that might allow studying a more culturally isolated group. My first solo trip was to visit the Kingdom of Tonga. In 2002, I headed to the capital, Nuku'alofa. I chose Tonga because it was one of the few nations on the planet that was never colonized. Once again, I assumed that going into the field with an experiment in hand was a bad idea. One should start by simply scouting out the situation and learning what you can by way of background, logistics, and so on. Of course, I was naive. Any seasoned traveler would have known how westernized even a place like Tonga would be. Tonga was not some sort of pristine cultural island, isolated from the Western world. I soon learned that the most popular music in Tonga was reggae, which, as it turns out, is popular throughout the Pacific. A couple of years later, I had an opportunity to visit a much more remote location, the remote Yavari region of the extreme western Amazon, on the border between Brazil and Peru. Here I'm romping around in the bush with my Peruvian guide, who's the one taking the picture. Incidentally, without a guide, you'd never find your way out of the forest, so you're trusting the guide with your life. Notice that despite the high heat, I'm wearing gloves and full clothing. That's because there are so many plants and trees that are poisonous if you touch them. Here we've come across a hunting lodge, which would be used occasionally by local men when on an overnight hunting trip. You might think this is a remote locale that people would have little exposure to Western music, but the Yavari region proved to be another disappointment. Folks in the forest had transistor radios, and they were familiar with Christina Aguilera and mariachi music. So now what? Around 2005, I gave up on the idea of finding truly musically isolated cultures. And instead, I came up with a new strategy for how one might conduct cross-cultural studies. I call it the cultural gradient method. Suppose you have a set of, say, 10 cultures that are all influenced by Western music, but to varying degrees. Suppose we carry out a single experiment and repeat it in all 10 cultures. If we could rank order the degree of musical westernization, then we could use degree of westernization as a covariate in analyzing the data. If we see pretty much the same or identical behavior across all 10 cultures, then that would suggest that the behavior has shared origins, either from shared environmental experiences or some innate human disposition. Conversely, if the behavior varies according to the degree of westernization, then that would be a strong indication that the behavior is the result of Western influence or Western enculturation. So the practical problem is to identify a range of cultures for which we might apply this cultural gradient approach. This is what led me to Micronesia. Micronesia is a geographical region in the Western Pacific consisting of over 600 islands with a total population of about 100,000 people. The region's west of Hawaii, north of Australia, south of Japan, and east of the Philippines. There are three main countries: the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Republic of Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia. The region also includes the U.S. territory of Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. So, why Micronesia? First, it's a large, culturally diverse region. The map here might give the wrong impression of size. The distance between Majuro in the east and Palau in the west is greater than the distance between New York and Los Angeles. The region spans several distinct cultures with at least 25 languages, representing three contrasting language families. The languages spoken on neighboring islands can be more contrasting than the difference between English and Russian, which are both Indo-European languages. Second, the large distances mean that there's not a lot of contact, either between the islands or with the outside world. For example, nowhere in FSM can you pick up a radio broadcast from Guam using an ordinary AM/FM radio receiver. Third, there's a wide range of Western influences. On the one hand, there are places like Guam that are thoroughly Westernized. At the other extreme, you have places like Yap State, where there are islands with very traditional cultures, where men wear loincloths and there's no media at all. Fourth, you can easily get around in English. Most of these island cultures have a history of inter-island conflict. They were initially not at all interested in joining together to form a single country, but the United Nations was simply opposed to the idea of recognizing a bunch of small countries, each with perhaps 10 or 20,000 inhabitants. As it stands, the Federated States of Micronesia has just 100,000 citizens, which still makes it one of the least populated countries in the world. When the United Nations forced the islands to amalgamate into a larger country, there was a problem of choosing a common language for government and business. The Chuukese didn't want to learn Pohnpeian, nor did the Cochéans want to learn Satawalese. So the official language for the Federated States of Micronesia is English. Cleverly, teaching English is forbidden until high school. So although the populations are small, the indigenous languages of Micronesia are largely robust and surviving well. From a research perspective, however, it's awfully convenient to travel between these many cultures and communicate adequately in English. So to recap, the first part of my project would involve visiting several of these cultures and characterizing the degree to which each culture was musically Westernized. So how might we measure Western music enculturation in some community? I settled on two approaches. I'd measure music Westernization by monitoring the available radio media on each island, and I'd also tally any music in the form of CDs or tapes available for sale on the island. So first, radio monitoring. On each island, I'd spend 3 days doing radio sampling. I had what I called my standard radio, and when arriving on the island, I would carefully scan the dial and identify all the radio stations that could be picked up by the locals. On some islands, that would mean as many as 3 stations. On other islands, they were so remote that no radio stations could be received unless you had special shortwave or ham radio equipment. Most commonly, there would be one radio station available, and that was typically the government-funded station located on the island itself. Here we see, for example, the radio stations for the islands of Kor, Majuro, Koche, and Yap. And here we see a couple of the DJs. As I noted, I'd spend 3 days sampling whatever radio was available on a given island. I classified the music into 4 categories: local music, that is, music sung in the local language; regional music, music from other parts of Micronesia; Pacific music, typically Hawaiian or Fijian; and Western music, usually American or British pop, or quite often Jamaican reggae. Apart from the radio sampling, I'd also spend time with locals asking where it was possible on the island to purchase music in the form of CDs or tapes. From these conversations, I'd identified the 3 best places where it was possible to purchase music. In many cases, there'd only be a couple of places where you could buy recorded music, and some of these places, the available music might simply be a collection of old cassettes for sale at a local grocery stand. In any event, I'd visit the 3 best venues for purchasing music and make a complete inventory of all the music that could be purchased. Once again, I classified the music into my 4 categories of local, regional, Pacific, and Western musics. Of course, some places in Micronesia are more developed or more remote than others. Here, for example, we see a billboard in Pohnpei advertising recent releases of locally produced music. However, few islands are as developed as Pohnpei. Some islands are much more remote than others. The most remote place we visited was Mogmog. In order to get there, you fly from Hawaii to Guam, and then from Guam to Yap. Once in Yap, you make arrangements to take a small missionary plane to Ulithi. Here I'm taking this picture with our baggage sitting on my lap. The yellow package to the left is the life raft should we end up in the water. Ulithi is a small speck of an island in the middle of a very big Pacific Ocean. Here you see that the pilot uses 2 GPS systems set to Ulithi. You use 2 GPS systems because without reliable navigation, you could easily end up lost in a vast expanse of blue water. As I mentioned, Ulithi is a very traditional place. The men wear loincloths, the women are bare-breasted, and there is no media available on the island or around the larger atoll. Once you arrive in Ulithi, you need to arrange to find someone willing to take you in a boat to Mogmog. By a boat, I mean a simple 14-foot open aluminum boat with a single outboard motor. You climb into that, and you head out into the open Pacific, heading for Mogmog. Micronesians are famous for their navigational skills, but what you most appreciate is their intuitions about the weather. Each day, your boat pilot will look up into the sky and make a call. Perhaps tomorrow it will be okay to go to Mogmog. Of course, apart from the challenges associated with arranging transportation to remote places, there are issues of finding water that you can drink, food you can eat without fear of illness, dealing with insects and oppressive heat, occasional language problems, and all the rest. It's not always easy, and it's not always safe, but it was always fascinating, and the natural scenery was often stunning. Over the next 5 years, we traveled back and forth to Micronesia, collecting data on the degree of music westernization. I assembled data from Majuro, Ponape, Koche, Palau, Yap, Ulithi, Mogmog, as well as more developed islands like Guam and Rota, and for comparison, Oahu in Hawaii. The good news is that I found very strong positive correlations between the radio samples and the retail samples. That is, the cultural mix evident in music for sale on any given island tended to reflect the cultural mix of the available broadcast music. The less westernized the radio programming, the less westernized the market for CDs and tapes. With this converging evidence, I could go ahead and make an estimate of the relative degree of music westernization for each of my target cultures. And here are the results. The most westernized are the Chamorros of the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, followed by the Majorons from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Palauans in the extreme west, followed by the Ponapeans, Kocheans, Yapese, Ulithians, and finally the folks from Mogmog. So with these estimates of musical westernization, the idea was that one could move on to part 2, arranging experiments employing my proposed cultural gradient method. At least that was the plan. Of course, the world doesn't stand still, and the best laid plans can always be waylaid by the unexpected. Perhaps that might be something bad, like Typhoon Maysak, which you see here, and which flattened Ulithi in 2015. In my case, the typhoon that upset all my research plans was the arrival of the internet. In just a couple of years, the listening habits of islanders was transformed, and there was no way to track the proliferation of MP3 files or otherwise easily determine what locals were listening to. In retrospect, it should have been obvious that the arrival of the internet was inevitable and that my long-term research plan was doomed. I learned a lot from my 15-year effort to try to bootstrap cross-cultural music experiments, but sadly, those lessons didn't relate to how people in different cultures experience music differently. Mostly, they were experiences that helped me learn about life in general, and of course, develop a deep appreciation for people who live very different lives from my own. So now what? One of the main achievements of music anthropologists has been the many wonderful archives of recordings and videos of indigenous music making in cultures around the world. Some of these recordings are available commercially through well-known sources such as the Smithsonian Folkways and the Radio France Okora labels. So the question arises, can we leverage the sound archives to investigate possible similarities and differences across musical cultures? For the remainder of my presentation, I'd like to focus on one of our cross-cultural corpus studies. This has been a multi-year effort involving many collaborators, and this slide shows the complete list of co-authors on this project. The goal of our study was to test 14 conjectures regarding melodic organization. All of the conjectures we tested have Western origins. They're either ideas arising from Western music theory, or ideas from empirical observations made by Western music cognition researchers. It bears emphasizing that the word universal means without exception. To my knowledge, there are no musical universals because there's no musical feature that doesn't have an exception. To the extent that we're interested in cross-cultural similarities, we're looking not for universals, but for what Bruno Nettel called statistical universals, or what might be better called cross-cultural tendencies. I'll begin by identifying the 14 conjectures we tested, briefly describe our musical sample and coding procedures, present the results, and then speculate a bit about how we might interpret the results. First, the hypotheses, all of which pertain to melodic organization. It's long been observed that melodies, at least in the West, tend to favor small pitch intervals. So our first hypothesis tests how well this observation applies beyond Western melodies. Western music theorists have also noticed that large pitch movements tend to ascend rather than descend. We'll refer to this as the leap ascension hypothesis. Paolo Amarante and Frank Russo have observed that large melodic leaps are more likely to occur in the lower pitch region for a given melody. So hypothesis 3 relates to what might be called low skip bias. Western music theorists, going back to the late Renaissance, identified a pattern in which large melodic intervals tend to be followed by a change in melodic direction. So, for example, a large ascending interval would be predicted to be followed by a tone that descends in pitch. We'll refer to this hypothesis as post-skip reversal. In his study of Western art music, Zohar Eitan observed a tendency for melodic high points, or peak pitches, to exhibit longer durations compared with other melodic tones. We might call this the agogic peaks hypothesis. Other research on Western music has noted that high register pitch sequences tend to move faster than low register pitch sequences. So think, for example, of a fast-moving piccolo passage compared with a slower-moving tuba passage. We'll refer to this as the lower-slower hypothesis. Another observation in Western music has been the tendency for large melodic intervals to be approached and or followed by tones of long duration, what might be called leap lengthening. In the 1980s, Dutch researcher Joseph Thomassen conducted a series of experiments and found that tones marking changes of pitch direction tend to be perceived as more accented, at least for Dutch listeners. So hypothesis 8 will test the generality of whether contour pivots tend to coincide with longer duration tones. In speech, phrase final lengthening has long been observed. The musical version of this is the conjecture that pitches at the ends of phrases will tend to be longer in duration. Again, in speech, phrase final pause has long been observed, where phrases or utterances tend to be followed by rests or silences. This might seem obvious, but it would be appropriate to conduct a formal test of that in a broad sample of music. In speech, it's also common to observe phrase final fall, where the pitch of a phrase or an utterance drops at the end. At least in Western music, there exists the concept of a cadence. The word cadence itself comes from the Latin cadentia, meaning to fall. So hypothesis 11 is intended to test the musical equivalent of phrase final fall. Once again in speech, prosody research has identified a general tendency for the pitch of a spoken utterance to fall over the course of the phrase. In prosody research, this is referred to as declination. In music, something similar has been observed, as in what Kurt Sachs referred to as tumbling strains. So hypothesis 12 is intended to test whether there's a general tendency for the pitch to fall over the course of an entire melodic phrase. Another feature of speech prosody is the tendency for pitch of the voice to exhibit initial rise at the beginning of the utterance. In Western music theory, there's a parallel concept in the notion of an anacrusis, or a pickup. In testing hypothesis 13, we'll aim to examine the generality of an initial rising pitch contour at the beginning of melodic phrases. Finally, Western music scholars have long observed an apparent tendency for melodic phrases to exhibit an arch-shaped contour, where the phrase tends to rise upward and then fall downward in pitch. We'll test this idea as well. So what was our musical sample? You can't assemble a cross-cultural body of music for study without making a lot of assumptions. These assumptions include what constitutes an appropriate cultural label, what is music, what is a musical work, what constitutes a musical phrase, and a host of assumptions regarding transcription. In our study, we offloaded many of these questions to people other than ourselves. For example, in endeavoring to assemble a potential representative sample of music from around the world, a critical question is how one defines music. Rather than come up with our own definition of music, we operationally define music as any sound recording released by the Smithsonian Folkways or Radio France Acora labels. What the Smithsonian and Acora curators consider to be music is undoubtedly biased in various ways, but for the purposes of our study, these are the biases of other people. Similarly, our definition of a musical work was offloaded as a recorded track on these same labels. In the case of defining a musical phrase, our principal operational definition was that it was a unit of sound whose beginning and end points are marked by the act of inhaling. There's plenty more to say about the various methods we used for this study, but we simply don't have time to review them all here. They're documented in tedious detail in the forthcoming paper describing this research. In the end, our purported world sample of melodic phrases drew on transcribed recordings we did for 45 different cultures. We'll refer to this sample as the Acora Folkways collection. In order to broaden the study, we supplemented our world music sample with 3 other convenience samples, specifically the Essen collection of European folk songs, the Essen Chinese folk song collection, and another collection of the Francis Densmore transcriptions of Native American songs. None of these collections is without its problems, but they nevertheless provide an opportunity for bootstrapping the research. These supplementary corpora added another 39 cultures, regions, or nations to the 45 in the Acora Folkways collection. Altogether, our sample includes more than 10,000 complete melodies or phrases, nominally representing 84 different cultures. That includes music spanning Acoma to Zuni cultures. This map identifies the various geographical regions represented in our musical corpus. All of the materials were encoded and processed using the Humdrum toolkit. As I've already noted, there's plenty to discuss about the sampling methods, the transcription procedures, and the analysis details, but given the limited time, let's simply skip ahead to the results. Incidentally, in light of the large sample sizes here, there's no point in reporting tests of statistical significance since everything is significant. In looking at our results, it's important to attend to the effect sizes. Let's start with pitch proximity. So do melodies favor small pitch intervals? The answer is yes. In all 4 samples, most melodic intervals are smaller than the average interval for individual musical works, and if you randomize the order of pitches, which destroys the note-to-note connections while maintaining the identical pitch distribution, the result is that the average interval size increases. So small intervals are favored in European folk songs, in Chinese folk songs, in Native American songs, as well as in our Acora Folkways world music sample. So we'll add a check mark here to indicate that the results are consistent with this hypothesis. Well, what about leap ascension? Do most melodic leaps tend to ascend? The answer is yes. In all 4 samples, the majority of intervals roughly 3 semitones or smaller descend in pitch, whereas the majority of intervals larger than roughly 6, 8, 9, or 10 semitones ascend in pitch. So yes, large intervals are more likely to rise in pitch. So what about low skip bias? Do melodic intervals tend to be bigger in the lower range of the melody? If we average the pitch height of the 2 tones forming the interval, we can then see how the average pitch height correlates with the interval size. If low skip bias exists, then there should be a negative correlation between interval size and pitch height. We can then simply tabulate the number of negative correlations where we treat each musical phrase as a single independent measure. This approach reduces its statistical power, but it better reassures us that the effect is widespread. This graph shows the proportion of negative and positive correlations for each of the 4 corpora. Both the Acora Folkways and the European samples are consistent with low skip bias, but the effect is weak for the Chinese sample and the reverse for the Native American sample. So this idea doesn't appear to have much merit as a cross-cultural statistical pattern. Moving on to post-skip reversal, are most leaps followed by a change of direction? If you understand the concept of regression to the mean, then you'll know that this must be the case for any range-limited distribution like sung pitches. And sure enough, that's what we see in all 4 samples. The larger the melodic interval, the more likely it is to be followed by a change of direction in the melodic contour. Since this is a statistical necessity, it's probably not something one should pay much attention to. Moving on to agogic peaks. Is it the case that peak pitches tend to be longer in duration? The answers are resounding no. It turns out to be the reverse. In all 4 samples, the lowest pitches in the melodic phrases tend to be longer in duration. So the original hypothesis isn't supported. But curiously, the evidence supports the reverse notion, what might be called agogic troughs instead of agogic peaks. That is, the lowest pitches in melodic phrases tend to exhibit longer durations. Continuing with the lower, slower hypothesis, do lower pitches tend to be longer in duration? Are higher pitches faster? Without going into detail regarding our analysis method, once again the answer is no. There's no evidence of a universal tendency to employ longer duration tones in the lower register of the melody. Leap lengthening is the idea that large intervals tend to be formed using tones of longer duration. A good example of this relationship is evident in the first phrase of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. By saying, somewhere over the rainbow, the large initial leap is framed by notes of long duration, whereas the ensuing smaller intervals are performed more rapidly. A simple way to test this idea is to calculate the correlation between interval size and the sum duration of the notes forming the interval. If melodic leaps involve longer duration notes, then we'd expect a positive correlation. Once again, we can then simply tabulate the number of positive correlations where we treat each musical phrase or melody as a single independent measure. As you can see in this graph, the effect is evident in all 4 samples, although the effect size is tiny in the case of the Native American songs. Actually, we conducted some follow-up tests on this idea. We found, for example, that the antecedent or initial note in a large interval is more likely to exhibit longer durations. Moreover, we also found that it's common to have repeated unisons prior to a large leap. It's reminiscent of an athlete preparing for a long jump by making a preparatory series of steps and then making the leap. When you amalgamate the preparatory unisons into a single duration, then the leap lengthening tendency becomes much more robust in the Native American songs. So yes, especially when we include unison leap preparations, we see evidence of leap lengthening in all 4 of our samples. Recall that Thomason found that pivot tones, or notes associated with a change of direction in a pitch contour, are associated with the perception of phenomenal stress or accent. So do we see evidence of this? For example, are changes of pitch contour associated with longer notes? And the answer is yes, although there is, once again, an exception in the case of the Native American songs. Incidentally, in a couple of minutes, we're going to see the reason why Native American songs often diverge from the patterns we've seen in other samples. We'll see that there are straightforward reasons why these exceptions arise. So for now, let's put a question mark beside our check mark. Moving on to our 9th hypothesis, do phrases tend to end with longer duration tones? A simple way to test this is to compare the duration of the final note with the immediately preceding note, or with the average duration of all the other notes in the phrase apart from the last note. With either measurement, we get the same result. In all cases, the duration of phrase final tones exceeds a 1-to-1 ratio. So, as in the case of speech, phrase terminating tones tend to be significantly longer than the other notes in the phrase. Also inspired by speech research is the concept of phrase final pause. So are rests more likely to occur at the ends of phrases? In the case of the Akora Folkways world music sample, this test is inappropriate, since hearing an audible breath or hearing a performer inhaling was one of the ways we operationally defined phrase boundaries. For the other samples, rests or silent periods do indeed tend to coincide with phrase boundaries. However, once again, there's a notable exception in the case of the Native American songs. So let's place a small provisional check mark here, accompanied by a rather big question mark. What about cadence or final fall? Do phrase final tones tend to be approached by descending motion? Here we can simply compare the proportion of final tones approached by ascending or descending pitch motion. The blue bars indicate the number of phrase final pitches approached from above, and the red bars indicate the number of phrase final pitches approached from below. It's evident that there's a big effect size in all 4 samples. That is, phrase final tones do indeed have a strong tendency to be approached by descending motion. Expanding the notion of descending pitch more broadly, we can ask whether phrases generally tend to fall in pitch. That is, do melodic phrases exhibit the sort of declination that speech researchers regularly observe in spoken utterances. A simple test of this idea would calculate the regression slope for each phrase in our sample and tally the number of positive and negative slopes. The number of phrases with descending slopes are shown here in blue. As you can see, there's a notable skew toward pitch declination. The effect for European folk songs, however, is notably tiny. This is perhaps ironic, because theoretical claims related to declination are inspired by Heinrich Schenker's Urlinie concept, so we might have expected the effect to be more evident in Western music. As we'll see shortly, however, there are good reasons why the effect is obscured in the case of European folk music. For now, we'll put a check mark here, since declination is at least statistically significant in all 4 samples. The companion idea to phrase final fall is the notion of anacrusis or pickup. So do phrases tend to begin with an initial pitch rise. Here we might simply look at the first 2 notes in the phrase and tally the number of occurrences of rising versus falling pitches. It turns out that the most common beginnings for Native American songs involves unison pitches. If we look beyond the initial repeated pitches, however, we find that in all 4 samples, there's a tendency to begin with an initial pitch rise or anacrusis. So yes, the results are consistent with a statistical tendency for pitches to rise at the beginning of the phrase. It turns out that we can gain some clarity regarding some of the mixed results we've seen by looking at our last hypothesis regarding arch contours. Do melodic phrases show an overall tendency to rise and fall, forming some sort of inverted U or arch-shaped contour? Perhaps the best way to examine melodic contours is simply to graph the average contours for different samples. A simple approach is to take all of the phrases having the same number of notes and average the pitches for each successive note position. That is, we'll average all the first notes together, all the second notes, and so on until the end of the phrase. Here, for example, is the average phrase contour for all 10-note phrases in the European folk song database. It shows a pretty clear arch tendency. It turns out that this is quite typical. You see the same arch-shaped contour for phrases consisting of 3, 4, 5, and more notes. Once you get to 12-note phrases, there's a sort of dip that appears in the middle. In my 1996 publication on the melodic arch, I called this the McDonald's effect. We can trace this to an artifact of a singer sometimes singing 2 phrases in a single breath. Here are the 10 and 12-note average phrase contours for the Chinese folk song database. Like the European folk songs, there's a tendency for phrases to rise and then fall, but the initial rise is more rapid, producing an inverted J-shaped average contour rather than a symmetrical inverted U shape. Finally, here are the 10 and 12-note average phrase contours for the Densmore Native American song database. In this case, we see a nearly straight downward line. It's declination without any apparent anacrusis. So let's compare these average phrase contours side by side. European phrases tend to exhibit an inverted U. Chinese phrases tend to exhibit an inverted J. And the Native American songs tend to exhibit a straight pitch descent. As Bruno Nettle observed, this downward line is quite characteristic of a lot of Plains Indian singing. An average contour graph can obscure many local features. For example, recall earlier that we already found that there is indeed a tendency for Native American phrases to begin with an initial pitch rise or anacrusis. But that's not evident in the average contour graphs, probably because there's also a tendency for many Native American songs to begin with unison repetitions before the initial ascent. So the averaging here obscures the statistical tendency for Native American songs to exhibit a brief initial pitch rise. In light of our earlier discovery of an anacrusis tendency, it's appropriate to add an initial hook to the schematic graph here to remind ourselves of this feature. All of our samples show a descending pitch tendency in the latter part of the phrase. The principal difference is with the initial rise. In the European phrases, the initial ascent is rather slow. In the Chinese phrases, the initial ascent is somewhat faster. And in the Native American songs, the phrase starts with a bang, although often with a brief initial anacrusis. Of course, there's a major pitch rise in Native American songs between phrases. That is, there's a large pitch rise from the end of one phrase to the beginning of the next. The differences in these contour shapes explains a lot of the differences we observed earlier, in particular some of the failures of the Native American songs to exhibit patterns that were evident in all of the other samples. For example, in contrast to the other samples, we didn't see evidence consistent with Thomason's pivot accent in the Native American songs. That is, we saw little evidence that changes of pitch contour in Native American songs are associated with longer notes. Well, compared with the other samples, there are many fewer changes of pitch contour in Native American songs, so we have little opportunity to observe whether there is such a relationship. Native American songs were also the sole exception to the low skip bias conjecture. However, there just aren't that many large pitch leaps in Native American songs. Once again, the big pitch skip comes between phrases, and in all of our tests, we explicitly excluded measuring intervals across purported phrase boundaries. So it's not as though Native American songs are contrary to Thomason's pivot accent or low skip bias. Instead, the conditions don't commonly arise in Native American songs that would allow one to see whether or not there would be such a tendency. Another exception we saw was the failure of Native American songs to exhibit phrase final pause. Ignoring the database and simply listening to the recordings, there is most certainly a tendency to pause between phrases in Native American songs. Native American singers breathe between phrases just like the singers in other cultures. It's just that Densmore failed to notate these in her transcriptions. Native American songs are not an exception to phrase final pause as a tendency. So what about the so-called melodic arch? As we can see, apart from European folk songs, there's no cross-cultural tendency to exhibit a melodic arch where an arch is considered to be a somewhat symmetrical inverted U contour. But all the repertoires do exhibit a general rise and fall tendency. So instead of a melodic arch, what we see across the samples is what might be better called a melodic arc, as distinct from an arch. So let's review. In our study of cross-cultural statistical tendencies in melodic phrases, we found no supporting evidence for lower, slower, anagogic peaks. We did find evidence consistent with cross-cultural statistical tendencies for pitch proximity, leap ascension, leap lengthening, post-skip reversal, melodic troughs, phrase final fall, phrase final lengthening, declination, anacrusis, and what we're calling melodic arc. If our account of the apparent exceptions for Native American songs is valid, then our study also implies cross-cultural tendencies for pivot accent, low skip bias, and phrase final pause. These results raise the question of where these apparent potential universal statistical tendencies come from. In assembling our musical sample, we explicitly aimed to sample musical lines in which performers were breathing. This biased the sample towards vocal music and instrumental music involving aerophones or windblown instruments. Our study is not really a study of musical melodies. Instead, our study explicitly focused on musical phrases. Our ideal operationalization of a phrase hinged on sound units whose boundaries were delineated by inhaling. This raises the question of how many of these features might originate in the physiology of breathing. Here, there are many parallels to explanations in speech prosody related to articulatory phonetics. In speech, pitch declination has long been explained by the reduction in subglottal air pressure as the lungs deflate over the course of a spoken utterance. This same account is likely to explain the pitch declination tendency we observe in all of our musical samples. It would also account for phrase final fall or cadential descent. The need to inhale offers plausible explanations for phrase final pause and possibly phrase final lengthening and melodic troughs. The high pulmonary energy associated with fully inflated lungs would appear to explain the initial pitch rise or anacrusis, and also the tendency for large leaps to ascend in pitch. The combination of anacrusis and declination would account for the general melodic arc trend. Incidentally, the principles leading to the melodic arc suggest that these same principles might account for the main patterns that underlie Schenkerian analysis. Schenkerians are observing real patterns in music. Well, mostly. But Schenkerian theory, I propose, mystifies something that's otherwise quite straightforward. Other melodic features have other plausible explanations. In other published work, I've shown that a general theory of motor movement known as Fitz's law can explain both the tendency for pitch proximity and for leap lengthening. In yet other studies with Paul von Hippel, we've shown that post-skip reversal is readily explained by the phenomena of regression to the mean. The main differences we see in contrasting the different samples relates to the speed of the initial ascent, fast for Native American songs, somewhat slower for Chinese folk songs, and rather slower yet for European folk songs. From the perspective of motor energy, they represent differences in how the initial pulmonary energy is released at the beginning of the phrase. That is, the cultural differences here relate to conventions related to how long the initial energy push is imparted to the phrase. It's long been noted that phrase contours are akin to the trajectories of moving objects. Phrases are launched, producing a characteristic trajectory. But the launch is more like a rocket rather than throwing a ball. In lobbing a ball, catapulting, throwing, tossing, or flinging an object, all of the energy is imparted right at the beginning. A single energy investment is made that starts the object in motion, and immediately the object begins to lose energy. However, that's not a good metaphor for musical phrases. Most musical phrases are pushed over a period of time rather than giving them a single shove or a kick. The launch is more like a rocket rather than throwing a ball. There's a period of active propulsion at the beginning of the phrase. What appears to differ from culture to culture is the duration of that initial propulsion. You can think of it as the duration that the rocket is burning fuel rather than coasting. In European folk songs, the burn lasts about half the duration of the phrase. In Chinese folk songs, the burn lasts less than a quarter of the duration of the phrase. And in Native American songs, the burn is very short, and some phrases are indeed better regarded as being catapulted or kicked into motion. In short, many of the statistical tendencies we've observed in our cross-cultural sample can be plausibly attributed to pulmonary and vocal motor properties. This suggests that the similarities in phrase-related melodic patterns arise from shared aspects of production rather than shared perceptual preferences. Of course, familiarity is known to induce liking, so one might expect preferences to emerge within each culture for the culturally normative melodic patterns. But the origin for the majority of these patterns appears to be the embodied production tendencies. The cultural variation we see seems to be linked to how the initial phrase energy is deployed. It bears emphasizing that our corpus study is necessarily correlational. In pursuing my cross-cultural interests, my initial hope had been to conduct true experimental studies. As remote cultures disappear and become more westernized, the opportunities for true cross-cultural experimental work will become harder and ultimately impossible. So we can expect that cross-cultural music research in the future will inevitably rely more on correlational rather than experimental methodologies. That means that causality will be more difficult to infer. Cross-cultural music research remains urgent. It's sufficiently pressing that, despite our differences, those of us who conduct empirical research need to make a renewed effort to build bridges to our colleagues in anthropology and ethnomusicology. We need to hear and respond to their critiques and also make an effort to explain our own methodological concerns. I think it helps to recognize that similarity and difference are two sides of the same coin we call description. Suppose, by way of example, you're asked to describe someone's face. You might say that the person has close-set eyes, a small mouth, or bushy eyebrows. Notice that these observations have meaning only by virtue of comparison with some sort of normative template. A person can have close-set eyes only because their eyes are closer together than the eyes of some average or normative face. Similarly, what we mean by bushy eyebrows is that the eyebrows are bushier than those typically encountered by the person making the description. When an anthropologist describes behaviors in some culture, they will omit all of the things that people do that are the same as what they're used to. Nobody reports that Eulithians walk upright on two legs, that they wash themselves with water, that they cover themselves when they're cold, or a million other behaviors that they share in common with other peoples. In short, all descriptions amount to caricature. We draw attention to, and so exaggerate, the features that differ from what we're used to. That is, description relies on deviation from what is typical or average for the observer, and that's determined by their past enculturated experience. You have to make use of more formal research methods in order to become aware of all the similarities that we take for granted. In the future, cultural isolates are going to be increasingly rare. However, as I've noted in earlier writings, we shouldn't underestimate the creativity of future researchers. In reviewing the current opportunities, I think we can identify at least 10 different approaches to cross-cultural empirical music research. The gold standard is still the cultural isolate study, where experiments are conducted contrasting the musical behaviors of two or more cultures that are nominally or entirely musically distinct. A much weaker version of this approach is the immigrant study, which takes advantage of the convenience of immigrant communities as a source of research participants. A stronger version of this is the consortium approach. The idea here is that a researcher assembles an experiment, but instead of traveling to a different locale, the experiment is run by several researchers in different parts of the world. For example, the same experiment can be run by a consortium of researchers recruiting participants in their home countries. Accordingly, the same experiment might be run in Germany, Egypt, India, China, and South Africa. To my knowledge, no one has done this yet, but if you're interested, I'd recommend contacting Chantal Hegde in Bangalore. For several years, Chantal and I mused about the possibility of starting up such a consortium. A fourth potential research approach might be the cultural gradient method, which I tried to make work in Micronesia. Perhaps it can be used in some other circumstance. Of course, rather than recruiting people from different cultures, much can be learned about innate human dispositions and the process of enculturation through infant studies. With the rapid improvements in technical developments, genetic studies are another source of insights related to human similarities and differences. Similarly, there are other opportunities to better understand the human propensity for music by contrasting human behaviors with the behaviors of other animals. A promising approach to understanding music and enculturation is the artificial culture method. Here, the researchers themselves create an artificial musical culture, expose participants to it, and trace how this culture is transmitted and transformed through techniques like observing so-called telephone studies. Of course, there are corpus studies, such as the one I've reported here. Corpus studies can focus on audio information, lyrics, symbolic transcriptions, and formal or informal ethnographic performance description. Pioneering work in this regard is Alan Lomax's Cantometrics, with more recent research such as the work of Pat Savage. A final approach might be called comparative ethnography, where researchers use content analysis to mine existing ethnographic descriptions, either using formal sources like the Human Relations Area files, or the vastly greater resources of the extant ethnographic writings. Cross-cultural research is challenging, but not impossible, and we will surely learn a lot by conducting comparative studies that focus on the remarkable range of human practices and behaviors found around the world. And with that, I thank you.